If you work as a manufacturing facilities engineer, installing a new piece of equipment can be as complex as the machinery itself. From prep work to alignment and testing, it's your team's job to put it all together. That's why it's good to have Grainger on your side. With industrial-grade products and next-day delivery, Grainger helps ensure you have everything you need close at hand through every step of the installation. Call 1-800-GRAINGER, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
This podcast is brought to you by Aura. Imagine waking up to find your bank account drained, bills for loans you never took out, a warrant for your arrest, all because someone stole your identity. Hackers aren't waiting. Why are you? That's why we're thrilled to partner with Aura. Your personal data is a goldmine for hackers, and Aura helps lock it down. Aura monitors the dark web, blocks data brokers from selling your information, includes a VPN for private browsing, and a password manager to secure your accounts before criminals break in. For a limited time, Aura is offering our listeners a 14-day free trial plus a dark web scan to check if your personal information has been leaked, all for free at aura.com/safety. That's aura.com/safety to sign up and start protecting yourself and your loved ones. That's aura.com/safety. Terms apply. Check the site for details.
Welcome to episode number 274 of Real Life Ghost Stories. And to kick things off this week, I would like to say thanks to some of our newest Patreon subscribers. I would like to thank James Donovan, Or F. Sydney, Katie Olson, and Jacqueline Stinson. Thank you so much for subscribing to the Patreon. I love you and appreciate you every single day. And our film review this week, our film review is Hallow Road. Hallow Road was released in 2025. It has 7.2 out of 10 on IMDb and 91% on Rotten Tomatoes. Two parents enter a race against time when they receive a distressing late-night phone call from their daughter after she caused a tragic car accident. There seems to have been very little promo for this film, to be honest, and I sort of only realised it was out because I was looking through my local cinema listings, and I love Rosamund Pike, who plays the lead role in it, right? So I was like, I'm definitely going to go and see this. And I'm just going to warn you now that there's going to be kind of mild spoilers in this film, but I would recommend wait until streaming to watch it anyway, because you know what? The first thing I wrote in my likes column was, at least it was short. So we're not off to a good start, and I sort of feel like, I don't know what film everybody else watched, but 7.2 out of 10 on IMDb and 91% on Rotten Tomatoes seems absurd to me for this film. All right, I'm just going to say it. I don't understand. Did I fall asleep and dream the film instead of actually watching it? Have I entered some sort of alternate dimension, some sort of alternate reality? I don't know. But, right, we're getting off piste. I'm sticking to the likes. Rosamund Pike is really good in this film, right? And I really truly believed her as a mother who is like wrangling with protecting her daughter and doing the right thing. So kind of 90% of this film is set in the car with the parents driving to kind of rescue their daughter who has just seemingly killed somebody in a car accident. And there are lots of mitigating factors at play that you sort of find out throughout the film that would mean that, you know, things would not be good for the daughter should she be discovered having done this, right? And it raises some great questions. So the premise is really good. You've got these two parents that are driving to their daughter's aid, and this awful thing has happened. And it asks some like really interesting moral questions about how far you will go to protect your children, and at what point do you need to step back and sort of allow them to face the consequences of their actions. Like, I'm not a parent, but I can imagine that there are parents out there probably listening who have had kind of shades of this situation before, where your kid ends up in a situation and you think, oh my God, how am I going to get them out of this? And then you're also thinking, or do I just let them figure it out themselves? And in this scenario, it's kind of like a worst case scenario. and both parents are wrangling with, do they allow their daughter to face the consequences, which will be devastating for all of them, or do they try and find a way out of this situation? And there is also a really interesting element about how we have different relationships with different parents. So her relationship with her mom seems to be different than her relationship with her dad. That plays out the entire way through, and we learn things about her through things that she has divulged to one or the other parent. And it's a really interesting look at the dynamics within families and how family dynamics play out in these kind of literal life or death situations. And I will always respect a low budget horror film, and I will especially respect a low budget horror film that takes place in essentially what is one location, which is what we see in this film. 90% of the action, like I said, takes place in this car, through the parents' conversation and through phone calls with their daughter. And I respect that as a premise, because it's difficult to pull off, right? I'm not sure if this film did pull it off, but I can see the vision, and I like when a horror film or a kind of psychological thriller of this nature tries to do something smaller scale and really focus in on the human relationships within the story. That I can get on board with. Which brings me to my dislikes, right? With all that being said, I just felt like this film was so disappointing. I don't know what the reviewers were watching, because I did not see the same brilliance as everybody else seems to have seen. And I thought there were hints at like a brilliant possible supernatural element to the story. Like we get these kind of flashes of fairy lore. You know, Hallow Road is in a wood where the fairies are said to be, and they will take sacrifices. And I was thinking, yeah, I love fairy stories. I love when we engage with fairy lore in the way that it's meant to be engaged with it, which is that it's terrifying. I also at one point thought we were going to enter into like a werewolf story, because there was these references to the full moon and we kept seeing the full moon, and neither of those elements went anywhere. And I'm not actually sure if the werewolf hints were intentional within the script, or if I was just grasping at straws in a desperate attempt to make the story more interesting for myself while I was watching it. And the film, like, it tried to espouse some real tension, right? And I think it achieved that in the very beginning. There is a protracted scene where the mum is trying to talk the daughter through CPR. Oh, and that was a hard watch. That was tense. But somehow it became less and less tense as time went on. And I just didn't believe the tension between the mum and dad in the end. And I'm not sure if that was to do with his performance. I don't feel like I particularly enjoyed his performance. But by the end of it, I was like, oh, get to the road or not. I don't actually care. I don't care what you find. I don't care what you see. I don't care. If it's not going to be fairies and it's not going to be werewolves, then I'm not interested. And like I said, I respect the fact that they, you know, did most of the drama of this film in this confined space, in this car, and through phone calls with their daughter where they have her on loudspeaker, right? So obviously you are privy to the conversations that they're having with their daughter. But I did think the telephone element at points, you know, it got to a stage where it felt forced. And to be honest, it ended up being really cringy. And I was like, oh God, really? Are we doing this? I can't say anything more than that without giving away what happens. And fundamentally, I hated the ending. It felt confused. It felt rushed. And then they tried to explain everything in one hideously obvious sentence, which made me really cross. And like, it was just like they'd gone, shit, I don't know if this film kind of ends the way that we think it should. And I don't know if the audience is going to understand what has just happened, so we're going to put it all into one sentence, which felt really cringy to watch. And here's the thing, right? Sometimes ambiguity is okay within a story. And sometimes it's okay to point to something and have the audience draw their own conclusions. I don't think everything needs to be spelled out in the way that it was at the end of this film. And I feel like it took away from everything that I had just watched. I felt like, oh, well, I've just wasted my time then watching all that unfold and all that discussion and discourse. What was the point? And maybe that is what took away from these little hints at fairy lore and werewolf lore. Like maybe maybe it was that final line that did it for me. I was like, oh, well, that was shit. Anyway, look, watch it, but wait until it comes out on streaming. It is worth watching for Rosamund Pike's performance because I think she's brilliant and I think she is the saving grace of this film, but I did find it frustrating and just lacking in general. I'm going to give it 2 stars. So that's 2 stars for Hallow Road.
If you work as a manufacturing facilities engineer, installing a new piece of equipment can be as complex as the machinery itself. From prep work to alignment and testing, it's your team's job to put it all together. That's why it's good to have Grainger on your side. With industrial-grade products and next-day delivery, Grainger helps ensure you have everything you need close at hand through every step of the installation. Call 1-800-GRAINGER, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
For 25 years, Brightview Senior Living Associates have been committed to creating a vibrant culture and delivering exceptional services, making Brightview a great place to work and live. If you're looking for a rewarding opportunity to serve your local community and grow, we want you to join our team. Brightview Senior Living is growing and actively seeking vibrant associates to join our community teams, including directors, healthcare, activities, hospitality, and dining. Apply today at careers.brightviewseniorliving.com. Equal employment opportunities. Text BV Jobs to 97211 to apply.
This podcast is brought to you by Aura. Imagine waking up to find your bank account drained, bills for loans you never took out, a warrant for your arrest, all because someone stole your identity. Hackers aren't waiting. Why are you? That's why we're thrilled to partner with Aura. Your personal data is a goldmine for hackers, and Aura helps lock it down. Aura monitors the dark web, blocks data brokers from selling your information, includes a VPN for private browsing, and a password manager to secure your accounts before criminals break in. For a limited time, Aura is offering our listeners a 14-day free trial plus a dark web scan to check if your personal information has been leaked, all for free at aura.com/safety. That's aura.com/safety to sign up and start protecting yourself and your loved ones. That's aura.com/safety. Terms apply. Check the site for details.
Which brings us to our story this week, and this is another one that has been hotly requested over the years. And it kind of deals with weird, spooky places where strange things happen and people kind of then assume that it's supernatural. Let's just dive straight into it. Bennington, Vermont. That all-American town with the red brick buildings, the church towers and clock faces on Main Street roads with sprawling nature just a stone's throw away. It's perhaps best known for the Battle of Bennington during the American Revolutionary War, which ended in a decisive victory for the American cause and contributed to the eventual British defeat at the battles of Saratoga. Since the 1700s, and due in part to the many deaths that occurred during the battles and skirmishes there, Bennington has been a hotspot for ghost sightings and paranormal activity. But there is one place in Bennington that stands out from the rest. The patch of land known as the Bennington Triangle. Coined by the American author Joseph A. Citro, the triangle encompasses an area across Vermont that has a noticeably increased number of strange and unusual occurrences. The exact borders of the triangle are not that well defined, but it's said that the epicenter radiates out from Glastonbury Mountain, most likely named after Glastonbury in England. Glastonbury Mountain has a long and dark history. The Native Americans who lived on the land before European settlers believed that the mountain was sacred but cursed. According to Algonquin folklore, up on the mountain are malevolent stones, said to capture those unfortunate enough to step on them. When that happens, these stones whip open and swallow their victims whole, never to be seen again. The indigenous tribes of the area would only ever venture up the mountain to bury their dead. Indeed, even today, trails up the mountain paths abruptly stop halfway, almost like people and wildlife alike dare to venture no further. If accounts are to be believed, those brave enough to wander off the paths report that the forest around them makes no sound at all. It's not so much that everything suddenly goes silent and the trees don't move and their leaves don't rustle in the breeze, but it's more like there's nothing else living on the mountain, like how birds go quiet when a predator is near. And nestled away in the mountain are the remains of ghost towns. The town of Glastonbury and the neighbouring township of Somerset were once thriving logging and industrial communities. Well, perhaps the term thriving is a bit of a stretch. The soil around both towns, but particularly the township of Glastonbury, is rocky and not a good fit for growing crops. Little food and harsh winters made the people who dared to live on Glastonbury Mountain hard and well equipped for manual labour like logging and lumber and charcoal production. But trees, even in the wild, are a finite resource. When the last usable tree was cut, towns like Glastonbury suddenly found themselves without a readily available source of income. It had been just over 100 years of scratching out a living in a difficult and inhospitable land. But the people of Glastonbury weren't quite ready to give up everything just yet. They doubled down and attempted to draw tourists up the mountain to take in the sights. This worked, barely, for a brief moment in time. But flooding took out the railroads and essentially cut the mountain off from the rest of the world. The people trickled out, and places like Glastonbury and Somerset dusted over into ghost towns. The buildings remain, but no one has lived there for almost 100 years. Legislature has now named them an unincorporated part of Vermont. A portion of the Appalachian Trail, aptly named the Long Trail, passes through Vermont and up over parts of the Glastonbury Mountain. Accounts say that paths that veer off into the ghost towns are not well marked, and an inexperienced hiker could easily become lost or disorientated in the unfamiliar and homogeneous landscape. The roads are rough. The weather is often cold and harsh, and there is little to no available shelter for someone in need to stumble across if they were ever to lose their way. So, perhaps, that explains the sheer number of people who have gone missing on the mountain. Or, perhaps, the Native American legends of a curse and magical rocks was more accurate than first believed. Over the years, there have been somewhere between 30 and 40 unexplained disappearances on Glastonbury Mountain. But amongst those were 5 individual instances that stuck out to author Joseph A. Citro at the time he was writing his books about the Bennington Triangle. Those 5 unexplainable disappearances started in 1945 and ended in 1950, with each one being stranger than the last. The first was 74-year-old Middy Rivers. Middy was a veteran outdoorsman. He often spent a lot of time up in his son-in-law's hunting camp along the Long Trail. He had the skill set to survive out in the harsh wilderness, and he was very familiar with the area. According to those who knew him, there were few who knew the mountain better. In fact, on the day of November the 12th, 1945, Middy was employed as a guide for a group of 4 other hunters. They spent the day up in Bickford Hollow before Middy led the group back down to camp. Along the way, Middy veered off from the group to check on something. Around 4 o'clock that afternoon, a friend saw Middy on a trail, walking in the opposite direction to the camp. No one was particularly worried at first, but alarm bells started ringing when Middy didn't come back that evening. The group of hunters that had been with him immediately sent word that Middy was missing, and the mountain erupted into a flurry of frantic activity. For the rest of the season, until the winter months made it too dangerous to continue, teams from Fort Devens and the Vermont State Guard covered the mountain. After a while, it became clear that if they did find Middy, they wouldn't be bringing him home alive. But everyone continued with the search in the hopes that, at the very least, they could bring Middy's remains back to his family so that he could be properly laid to rest. But Middy was nowhere to be seen. It was almost like he had upped and vanished right into thin air. The following spring, another hiker found his handkerchief while out on a trail further south of his last known location. But that is all that has ever been recovered. Middy was the first in a list of disappearances that would catch author Joseph A. Citro's attention. Paula Jean Weldon would be the next. Almost a year to the day that Middy Rivers walked into the wilderness of Glastonbury Mountain, 18-year-old sophomore student at local Bennington College, Paula Weldon set out on a journey of her own. She left her house that early afternoon, telling her roommate that she was heading out on a hike. Her path took her up parts of the Long Trail and along Route 9 near Harbour Road, about 2 miles from where Middy had last been seen. She hitched a ride with a local man, because that was the time when hitchhiking was decidedly more normal. He took her all the way from campus to a known site on Route 9, and that was the last he saw of her. After that, several other witnesses placed her on the trail, including an employee of a local newspaper who ended up giving Paula directions. These witnesses confirmed that Paula had been wearing a red jacket, jeans, and lightweight sneakers. It was clear that she wasn't dressed for much more than a hike and didn't plan on spending the night on the mountain. She didn't have any heavy-duty clothing on her or camping gear, and it was December. A night out on the mountain was going to be no picnic. When Paula failed to turn back up at home and go to class the following morning, her roommate reported her as missing. Procedures were already in place, seeing as Middy had gone missing just over a year before, but there was a bigger sense of urgency this time. Paula was no experienced outdoors woman, and she was an 18-year-old college student with her entire life ahead of her. Everyone wanted to bring her home and bring her home alive. A large number of teams were deployed out into the mountain. The FBI got involved. The media covered her case extensively and spread news about the $5,000 reward for any information that would guarantee Paula's safe return. But this time the mountain offered up not even a handkerchief. Paula was just gone. But her disappearance did lead to the formation of the Vermont State Police. It was the hope that with a new police force, also trained in search and rescue tactics, and with experience of being on the mountain, a case like Paula's would never happen again. And perhaps it worked for a while. It would take the Triangle another 3 years to claim its next victim, but the next one it would take would be one of its most notorious. The Bennington Triangle is not so much of a triangle per se, but more like a square. It still centres around Glastonbury Mountain, but then it stretches down to the neighbouring towns of Woodford, Shaftesbury, and then Bennington itself. It's square in shape, yes, but why call it that when a triangle conveys the image of the mysterious disappearances that go on between its borders much more clearly? And it is the disappearance of James Tedford in Bennington that defines one of the pivotal corners of the not quite triangle. James was a 68-year-old World War I veteran who was living in the Vermont Soldiers' Home in Bennington at the time. It was December the 1st, 1949, exactly 3 years to the day that Paula went missing up on the mountain. James had spent the day in nearby St. Albans, visiting relatives. His relatives took him to the bus stop that evening and made sure that he boarded the bus back to Bennington. They know, without a shadow of a doubt, that James was on the 1815 bus from Burlington to Bennington. But no one, and I mean absolutely no one, remembers James ever getting back off. The driver of the bus claims to have seen James still on the bus all the way up until the last stop, which was Bennington itself. But when the driver pulled into the bus stop and turned around to order any passengers off the bus, he found that it was already empty. He searched around, confirming that he was indeed alone, and then he called it a night. He played the whole incident off as him misremembering or possibly missing the fact that James had gotten off at the earlier stop at Brandon. A man matching James's description was later reported as acting strangely in the Brandon's downtown area that evening, but his identity was never confirmed. It would be a whole week before anyone noticed that James Tedford was missing. He had not returned to the soldier's home since leaving to visit his relatives in St. Albans, and a subsequent investigation led the authorities right to the bus driver who had driven James home that evening. It was then that it all came crashing back to the driver. He realised that he had never actually seen James get off the bus that evening. In fact, up until the search, he'd been absolutely certain that James had been on the bus only moments before. So where did James Tedford go? Some believe that he vanished into thin air just like Middy and Paula before him. And it wouldn't take the triangle another 3 years to claim another victim this time. It would take less than a year. Paul Buddy Jepson was only 8 years old. He was born with something called a nervous condition at the time, which would probably be diagnosed differently today. He was known to display repetitive patterns of behaviour, and his fields of interest were incredibly limited. It is said that he was a late speaker, and when he did speak, he seemed to find it difficult to do so. He seemed developmentally young for his age, was shy around strangers, and was known to display socially inappropriate behaviour around others. His parents had taken him all the way to Boston to seek medical attention, where a doctor had informed them that Buddy would probably be dealing with his condition his entire life. But his parents loved him, and they did everything they could to help Buddy thrive with the resources that they had to hand. He spent a lot of time with his family on the farm. He was homeschooled and often accompanied his parents when doing chores that took them off the property. That was why he was with his mother in October 1950. The family owned a large herd of pigs that they kept on the Bennington town dump. The situation was not as dire as it sounds. The dump was spread over large acres of untamed wilderness for the pigs to roam around, and the Jepsons were actually hired by the town of Bennington to manage the dump. That's why they were able to use the good land around the dump, and because Buddy would often help out with the chores, he was with his mother that day to tend the pigs. But the weather was cruel that afternoon. It was cold and raining heavily, and Buddy didn't want to get out of the car. Not wanting to force him, his mother let Buddy wait in the car for her and went off to see to the pigs. She was gone for about half an hour. When she came back, Buddy was gone. It was around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and there were 2 hours of daylight left. His mother had a quick look around before rushing to a nearby farm to call back home to her husband. Both of them were worried, but not overwhelmed. Buddy had wandered off from them on at least 2 other occasions, but the main difference was that on those other times he had stripped in the process. His parents had been able to follow the trail of clothing Buddy had left behind him and find him right away, but this time there were no clothes to follow. The family searched around the dump as best they could before calling the police. The police did the same thing and focused the search mainly around the dump. There were a lot of places that a child like Buddy would be able to hide if he had felt like it, and unfortunately, many of those would have been old fridges that would seal tight and be impossible to open from the inside. But the sniffer dog picked up Buddy's scent and led the investigators away from the dump and through the forest. The trail went all the way up to the highway, where his scent abruptly vanished. It was the same highway that Paula Weldon had vanished from not 4 years before. At first, the police believed that the heavy rain had washed Buddy's scent away, but his father believed differently. He thought that Buddy had possibly been killed in a hit and run, and instead of facing the consequences, his killer had bundled Buddy's remains into their car and driven off. But others had different theories. Some claimed to have seen Buddy crawling along the road near an abandoned mine. Some believed that a sexual psychopath had escaped from a nearby mental institution and kidnapped the boy. A fortune teller told Buddy's grandmother that they would find Buddy's remains buried under leaves on the mountains. And according to his father, Buddy had been fixated on Glastonbury Mountain. He said that Buddy had talked about nothing else for days. and that he believed that seeing the mountain so close had possibly lured Buddy out of the safety of the car and into the dangerous wilderness. Following only 16 days after Buddy was 53-year-old Frida Langer. Frida, just like Middy had been, was a skilled outdoors woman. She knew what she was doing, and on that October morning in 1950, she was with her husband and cousin in the woods near Somerset. The family had a cabin on the shores of the Somerset Reservoir, so they knew the area well. It was the middle of the day, around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, when Frida slipped and fell into a stream. Her clothes were soaked with ice-cold water, and Frida wasn't about to continue the hike under those circumstances. She told her husband and her cousin that she would take a shortcut back to the cabin and catch up with them later. Frida set off to change her clothes, and the triangle claimed another victim. As soon as they realised that Frida was missing, her family reported it to the police. With Buddy having gone missing only days before, the response was quick and definite. Aircraft and helicopters took to the air while about 300 people combed through the forest. The real danger was that Frida suffered from a condition that caused her to have occasional seizures. Her husband feared that the cold from the water and then the cold autumn air had caused her to have another seizure while she was alone in the wilderness. It was impossible to tell. Not because the triangle kept her remains like it had with all the others, but because by the time it had given them back in the spring of 1951, the damage was extensive. A fisherman found Frida almost 4 miles away in the Deerfield River. She was in the tall grasses, in an area that had already been searched multiple times before. Her remains were so badly decomposed that no cause of death could be determined. And with the exception of Frida, no other remains were ever recovered, and no traces, aside from Middy's handkerchief, were ever discovered. So what happened to the unfortunate 5 who disappeared within the boundaries of the Bennington Triangle? Some theories speculate that they fell victim to the wild man. Reports from 1867 claim that a naked man dressed only in a coat flashed the residents of Bennington while waving around a pistol. He then took off and hid in the forest, and it's said that he lived in the boulder caves for a time. But shortly after that, a stagecoach was forced to stop on a washed-out road. They were then attacked by a wild creature resembling a man with glowing red eyes. It allegedly threw itself at the coach, knocking it over before roaring and disappearing back into the forest. Then, in 1943, right before the disappearances in the triangle would really kick in, a man named Carol Herrick was found in the woods. It looked like he had been squeezed to death, and his body had been surrounded by huge footprints. There have been many sightings of Bennington's version of Bigfoot over the years, but nothing concrete. It seems the triangle itself continues to be a hotspot for UFOs and ghost sightings and paranormal activity, but perhaps we've turned a corner when it comes to the unexplained disappearances. In 2008, a 27-year-old Bennington college student named Robert Singley got lost in the Glastonbury Mountain. It seemed like history was about to repeat itself, but the memory of Paula Weldon herself would step in. It was the Vermont State Police, the very police force that had been created as an answer to Paula's disappearance, that would find Robert. And this time, they brought him home alive. Now, I'm going to say this as somebody who has watched an inordinate amount of horror films. If Indigenous people are saying, stay away from this area, I would recommend staying away from this area. If you don't believe that rocks are opening up to swallow people whole, then maybe you best believe that these rocks that are swallowing people whole might just be metaphorical. And it might just be a metaphor for a mountain that is incredibly dangerous. Look, I get it, right? I am joking. I get it. There are people that live in the mountains and live very well in the mountains and are very experienced outdoors people and can survive very well in difficult circumstances, right? But it always baffles me when particularly American listeners are like, yeah, I went on a hike and I had to bring like my bear spray and there was, I don't know, fucking bobcats and cougars. Like, why are you going there? You know, and sometimes I see things where it's like, if you see this type of bear, you do this. If you see that type of bear, you do this. If I'm up a mountain and I see any kind of bear, I tell you what I'm doing is sprinting, okay? I'm not going to remember to curl up into a ball if it's a brown bear or whatever it is that you're meant to do. I find it absolutely mind-blowing that you be walking around with these big predators. Just mind-blowing. If I have to camp somewhere, which is very unlikely because I never want to camp anywhere anyway, and I have to put my food into some sort of bear-proof contraption so as not to attract bears, I'm not going. The minute you mention bears, cougars, mountain lions, bobcats, whatever, I don't care. The minute you mention it, I'm out. I'm staying in a hotel. I'm not doing it. I literally screamed the house down a couple of weeks ago because a larger than average beetle was in the kitchen. It was lying on its back, kicking its legs in the air, doing no harm to anybody. And when I say I lost my shit, I lost my shit. Equally, on that same trip, I saw a hornet and rolled over so aggressively on the grass in a panic, trying to get away from it, that I knocked everybody's drinks over. So don't you be inviting me camping on trips where there might be big predators, okay? Anyway, here's the thing, right? Do I think that the Bennington Triangle is some sort of paranormal hotspot in terms of disappearances? I have to say no, right? And hear me out on this one. I think that if this author had not put together these particular disappearances and said, you know, weird things happen within this Bennington Triangle, then probably the conversation wouldn't be happening, because people disappear all over the mountains, all over the world, all the time, particularly in terrain such as this, that seems to be historically considered quite dangerous terrain. If the indigenous people are saying, hey, this mountain is sacred, but it's also cursed, there are rocks that will open up and swallow people, you could deduce from that people have been disappearing on this mountain for a very long time. That doesn't necessarily mean they're being sucked up into an alien spacecraft or they're being eaten by Bigfoot. Actually, what that probably means is that this is incredibly dangerous terrain, and one wrong move can result in you going missing. But equally, you know, people who maybe have seizures, have a fall, you may not get found. And I think the thing with these stories is that when we hear people like Midi, for example, who is a seasoned outdoorsman, right? We know this person knows the mountain like the back of their hand. When we hear of somebody like that going missing, you think, hang on, they can't possibly have gotten lost or gotten turned around in the mountain. That's not possible. Surely them, of all people, would be perfectly safe on the mountain. And sometimes it's easier to believe that something supernatural or paranormal is going on, because that is easier to get your head around than the idea that a place can be so dangerous that even somebody that is really familiar with it can make one wrong move for whatever reason and be lost forever. And wrong moves can be made for all sorts of reasons. It could have been that they had a medical episode and therefore they did something that they wouldn't ordinarily have done, or they panicked. It might be as simple as they took a wrong turn. They might have become injured. They might have fallen down some sort of ravine. You know, there's lots of things that can happen. Equally, in our later story of Frida Langer, we see that she had fallen into ice cold water before she went missing. We know that hypothermia can cause people to behave in really strange ways that seem completely at odds with the situation that they are currently in. Now, regardless of what the cause of these disappearances are, it you know, they still remain absolute tragedies and devastating to the community and their families. And I can't even imagine what it must be like for a loved one to disappear and for you not to get closure. That must be just incredibly difficult, that you don't find remains or a body or some indication of what happened. That must be devastating. And to sort of briefly engage with some of the theories, like, Do I want to think it's Bigfoot? Kind of no, because I always feel like Bigfoot is a bit... Like, I feel like Bigfoot is benevolent. I don't know if that's just me. I know we've done stories like the Battle of Ape Canyon and stuff where Bigfoot is like scrapping with people, but I feel like that's when people encroach on his territory, right? So for the most part, in my head, Bigfoot is just this sort of benevolent being that lives in the forest and kind of mooches around doing his own thing. I don't imagine him as being this entity that is a threat and will come and kidnap you. I know that all of the erotica writers out there would like to think that Bigfoot spends all of his time kidnapping people and etc. Alright, if you've listened to Bigfoot erotica, you know what I mean. But I just think that Bigfoot is living his own life. I don't think he's, capturing people and squeezing them to death. And I have to say, and I know it's not funny, but I did laugh at the wild man reports from the 1860s that this naked man dressed only in a coat was flashing the residents while waving a pistol, and then he, lived in the caves and therefore he was a wild man. No, he wasn't a wild man. No. He was probably a flasher and probably got some sort of sexual satisfaction from showing people his penis and maybe had mental health issues. But I don't know if that constitutes being a wild man or akin to Bigfoot, to be really frank. Do I think that Bigfoot exists out there in the wild? I don't know. I hope so. Alright, and I would like to think that Bigfoot is seen every so often and, is just living his life quietly, doing his own thing. Yeah? But I don't necessarily believe that these disappearances are paranormal. And I think that if Citro had not written about the Bennington Triangle as he coined it, then we probably wouldn't still be talking about it in the way that we are. And also, I think it's a bit of a stroke of genius to refer to it as the Bennington Triangle. We spoke a couple of weeks ago in the film review about how triangles are used in folklore a lot because apparently humans have like this natural suspicion of triangles, which is wild. And it is, triangles are referenced in folklore a lot as like Father, Son, Holy Spirit, as, all these different folkloric deities are represented by triangles. You've got things like the Bermuda Triangle. So referring to this square of land as the Bennington Triangle was a stroke of genius in terms of its paranormal allure. And there is nothing I love more than a bit of poetic license. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of Real Life Ghost Stories. If you would like to send in your story, you can do so by emailing it to reallifeghoststoriespodcast@gmail.com. You can also check out the website, reallifeghoststoriespodcast.com. And if you are desperate for some extra content, you can subscribe to the Patreon. That is patreon.com/reallifeghoststories, where for $5 a month or $2 a month, you can get access to heaps of extra content, as well as every single main and mini episode completely ad-free. And on that note, I shall see you next time.
If you work as a manufacturing facilities engineer, installing a new piece of equipment can be as complex as the machinery itself. From prep work to alignment and testing, it's your team's job to put it all together. That's why it's good to have Grainger on your side. With industrial-grade products and next-day delivery, Grainger helps ensure you have everything you need close at hand through every step of the installation. Call 1-800-GRAINGER, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.